Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to a Bible study. We have some of our members are not able to be with us because of the virus and because of quarantining, that they themselves may not have the virus, but family members or people they've been around have had or have the virus. And so for safety reasons, to try to prevent the virus from spreading to other people, they're not able to come out and be with us. I want you to know that you are missed, and we look forward to a time we can come back together again. And hopefully that this will be a distant memory for very long as far as the virus and its effect on society and the church in particular, as it has had a kind of a discouraging effect at times upon families and even upon whole congregations. But I'm thankful that you are watching this. And perhaps for those who are living in other areas, that you may also be shut in. Weather may have hindered you, and that we are thankful, though, that you are watching this and want to invite you to ask any questions that you have. Obviously, this is not interactive right now, but you can still leave comments with questions and be free. Feel free to do that, and I'll be glad to answer those. We've been studying out of the book of Nehemiah, and quite frankly, it seems like we've slowed down a lot this last month for two reasons. One is that the lesson that deals with chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 covered a lot of material. And so I went ahead and divided that into two parts here. I did 7 and 8, one lesson, and then 9 and 10 in a separate lesson. And so that made it longer. And then also in February, we finally had winter. I know many of our friends and family out in Oklahoma have had a long winter. Our winter here in Kentucky has been very mild until February. And so because of the snow, we've had actually missed 2 Wednesday nights in February. So that slowed us down too. But we're going to pick back up here in Nehemiah. And maybe because of the fact that we have missed quite a bit of time, and just a brief reminder of what we studied in the last lesson. And chapter 7 gives us a list of the genealogy of people that came back from the captivity during the days of Zerubbabel. And that's actually the same list we have given to us in Ezra, the 2nd chapter. It's important to remember that these names are from tribes, and these tribes are important as being able to trace the lineage of the children of Israel. Important as far as inheritance, as far as getting back the land that they had left behind, their forefathers left behind. Also, for the sake of the priesthood, being high priest, and also those who serve in the temple. All these lists are important for them to be accurate. So we have in chapter 7 this list. In chapter 8, we had the reading of the law of God, where all the people of Israel come together there at Jerusalem, and they read the law of God, and we see that the rejoicing that was done on that occasion. I kind of described that as a spiritual revival of the children of Israel. And then chapter 9 is a continuation, and in some ways a continuation of chapter 8, although it's the next day. And what we have there is more of a sorrowful event, and that is we have a prayer, in essence, of Ezra, relating to Israel, how God had blessed them, but how they reacted to God, the sins of Israel. It kind of gives us a history lesson about sin of the nation of Israel and God's good treatment of them despite their sins, but that they sinned against God, and one of forgiveness, asking forgiveness, recognizing the very reason they're in the position they are now, the reason that Jerusalem had been destroyed and they had been carried out captivity was because of sin in their lives. And so that's chapter 9. In chapter 10, as you look at it, we have basically a renewing of the covenant, not a new covenant being made, but renewal of the covenant. And this here relates directly to this lesson, because some of the things they had promised in this chapter 10, they had not taken very long before they forgot about, apparently. They started violating some of their own promises. And so they had promised things such as, they had promised in verse 28 and 29 that they were going to walk according to the commandments of the law of God. They're going to keep the law of Moses, all of the law of Moses. They had promised in verse 30 that they would not give their daughters or the sons of people of the land to get married to. They had promised also that then in verse 31 that they were going to keep the Sabbath day. They were going to honor it as God had given to them. And also they had promised that they were going to tithe and take care of the temple as they had as they're supposed to be doing. and then in essence the tithing, the Levites be supported from their giving. And so that's all important here, because as we start in chapter 11, we first of all, one of the problems that the children of Israel had is that Jerusalem, although they had rebuilt the temple, they had rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem, and that they had not really inhabited the city itself. And so we look at chapter 11, verse 1, we find there's a lack of people there, and so they had to remedy that situation. And in verse 1, it said the rest of the people, let me just start verse 1, starting verse very beginning, said, now the leaders of the people who dwelt at Jerusalem, the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city. And so in essence, they had a lottery so as to get people into Jerusalem. And then also there's a second group of people talked about here in verse 2, and that is, and the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. And so you had a city without enough people. And you start thinking about what happens when you have a city without enough people. What happens if Jerusalem continues to be a city without people? Well, you need people for a city to function. You need people partly for the idea of defense, to have enough people to defend the walls and to keep guard over the walls and the gates, but also the function as far as everyday activities have to be going on in the city, the temple being worshiped, people coming in and out of Jerusalem. And so there's a lot of things that would be necessary to be done, and without people, they would not be done. And so that's one of the things here. And so as we go on then, we have a lottery. And one of the reasons I will say that maybe Jerusalem did not have enough people was because originally, whenever Jerusalem had been destroyed and people, Jews, carried off by Babylon into captivity, some of the inhabitants of Jerusalem had died. And so it may have been partly that is, their lineage would have been from other places. And so those people went out to the neighboring towns and places in the land of Canaan to live, where their forefathers had lived, but they needed them to come in Jerusalem now. So they had this lottery, and then also you have some people said, we will voluntarily go and live in the city. As we look at it, then in this chapter, we see a succession of the high priest given to us. In chapter 12, verse 7, it says to us, these were the heads of the priests and their brethren in the days of Jeshua. And so you have then in verse 10 this lineage of the high priest, in essence, and that is, you had Jeshua, who begot Jehoiakim, who begot Eliashib, who begot Jehoiada, who begat Jonathan, and Jonathan begat Jaddua. And so you have there, I think, 6 generations priests actually given to us, and this would have been from the time of Zerubbabel came back from Jerusalem in about 538 BC to the current time period of about 430 BC. And so about 100 years have passed, and you have 6 generations of high priest. Then we have a dedication of the wall itself. And as you built this wall, and so as you go through this 12th chapter, starting verse 27, we see a procession of things happening. And this may be a good time if you don't have a map of Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem. Maybe if you have access to computer, to Google it, and you can kind of hit the pause button in this lesson. But maybe kind of just bring up a map of Jerusalem, and one that shows you all the different locations of everything around the city, around the wall, because you don't have mentioned there a lot of things, and we just kind of, in my mind's eye, maybe see this happening a little bit easier. But in verse 27, the Levites gathered in their places. And then in verse 28, the singers gathered together. So you had the Levites, you had the singers. Verse 29, you had the purification of the priests mentioned there, the Levites, the gates, and the the walls were all purified. And in verse 30, you had the leaders of Judah upon the wall. 2 choirs are set up, one on the wall toward the refuse gate. And so that would be where your map would be helpful to see that. Some of the priest's sons with trumpets. Verse 36 talks about musical instruments with Ezra by the fountain gate. And then in verse 38, the second choir is on the wall past the tower gate. And so you have on kind of 2 opposite sides of Jerusalem, of the wall there, as the 2 choirs stood in the house of God with Nehemiah and the leaders. So what they did is they go around the walls of Jerusalem, on top of the walls, and some of the excavations show that parts of that wall have been about 9 feet wide at top, and some about 16 feet wide. So it wouldn't be hard at all to get people up on the wall to walk around it like this. But they stood with Nehemiah and the leaders. And I talk about the choirs at the house of God. And in verse 43, we have an offering of the sacrifices that were made on that occasion. So you have this grand assembly, in essence, to bless the fortification of Jerusalem. And at that point here, if you start around verse 44, I'll just read verse 44 through 47 here. And it says, at that same time, some were appointed over the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings. All these things are important, just like all the men listed in chapter 7 are important because they signify the roles they have, whether priests or helpers in the temple or singers or doorkeepers. All these individuals were important for everything to function smoothly. Well, same thing here about the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings. They say the first fruits. Now, one of the things the children of Israel promised earlier was that they were going to give all the first fruits as commanded by the law to the priests, for the reasons of supporting the priest and to God. And it said the tithes to gather to them the fields of the cities, the portions specified by the law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced, so the priests and the Levites who ministered. Both the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of the purification, according to the command of David and Solomon his son. For the days of David and Asaph, of old there were chiefs of the singers, songs of praise, thanksgiving to God. In the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, a portion for each day. They also consecrated holy things for the Levites, and the Levites consecrated them for the children of Aaron. So the very logical process here, and that is you have to have a gathering of these things so as to support I talked about here, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites. You're going to have someplace stored up. You're going to have somebody who's going to oversee this money or these things. And so that's what they set up right here. Nehemiah is very much a delegator, very much a person organizer of the people of Israel. It was one of his strong points as a cupbearer for the king. And so as it goes on then, in chapter 13, we have problems talked about here. Chapter 13 deals with a lot of the issues. Now, we just got this through seeing how they had dedicated themselves to keeping the law of God, how they had dedicated the walls, how they had set up for the tithes. And so as you go on here in the 13th chapter, problem number 1 is mentioned. It says, in verse 1, it says, on that day they read the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God. And it gives us the reason here, and the reason goes back to Numbers, the 22nd chapter, chapter 22, 23 in particular. And that is because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. And this deals with the children of Israel when they were wandering in the wilderness. They had time for them to go to the land of Canaan, and they had asked for permission to go through the areas of Ammon and Moab, and basically both those countries said, no, we won't let you go. In fact, they hired Balaam, Moabites hired Balaam to curse children of Israel. And as was pointed out here in the last part of verse 2, it says, however, our God turned the curse to a blessing. So it was when they heard the law that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. So they said, you're not supposed to be intermarrying with them, you're supposed to keep yourself separate from them. And they found out they had not done that. And as you go on in this chapter, that we have another problem then. Problem number 2. Now, problem number 1, they had not separated themselves from the Ammonites and the Moabites, as they should have done. Problem number 2 is Tobiah. Now, Tobiah was somebody that earlier in the book of Nehemiah had stood against children of Israel and had tried to stop them from building the walls around Jerusalem. He was an enemy of children of Israel. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at chapter 13, verse 4 to 5, it said Elisha had moved Tobiah into the temple chambers while Nehemiah was away from the city. Nehemiah had gone back to the king, and he served under Artaxerxes, and he had been there for a time period. But so basically, while he's gone, you find that Elisha, who was in that lineage of the priesthood, had allowed Tobiah to move into the temple, not just into Jerusalem, but into the temple chambers. And as you go on in chapter 2, verse 10, it mentions to us again who Tobiah was. It's a Tobiah the Ammonite official. And so this was one of those people that they weren't supposed to have anything to do with anyway. This was the enemy of the children of Israel, enemy of building the walls around Jerusalem. And now they had allowed him to go inside the temple itself, to set up residence there, in essence, inside that temple. Well, as you go on here, we find that created a problem, a number of problems. In verse 10, it says, I also realized that the portions for the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levite singers that did the work had gone back to his field. Now, as you think about this, the reason was that basically that they had taken this area that was supposed to be for the gathering of these tithes, and they had moved Tobiah in there. And so they weren't doing, their bad decision about Tobiah led to other bad things. And that's one thing I think you see here in this chapter. And that is when sometimes we look at the law of God and we say, I don't see what harm it is to do this. I don't see why it really matters if we do this or if we allow something like this to happen. But everything we do influences other things. That here we have Tobiah moving into the temple and using it as a residence, at least part of it as his residence, and we see that the part of the result of that is that the Levites had not been given their portion. So it says, for each of the Levite singers who did the work had gone back to his field because they were not to be supported. You really can't hardly blame these Levites and the singers because they had to provide for their families. And it reminds me that today, not so much as times past, that a lot of times gospel preachers were not supported well. And therefore, their families were hungry. Their families did not have all the necessities they really needed. And so sometimes the preachers would go back to secular work. They go and they do something else, and somebody criticized them because of it. Or maybe they criticized their families because they weren't as well-fed or well-dressed as other families. Well, you can't starve people to death and then complain about the fact they're hungry. Well, these Levites, these men here, had not been provided for as they should have been. And so what they do is they go back out into work. And so verse 11 says, so I contended with the rulers. It says, why is the house of God forsaken? And they gathered them together and set them into their place. In other words, he addressed this directly. And not at the Levites, but at the people in charge responsible for this, and that is the rulers. Why have you allowed this to happen? Basically, what Nehemiah is saying to them. And so the result then in verse 12, then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain and new wine and oil to the storehouse, and I was appointed as treasurers of the storehouse. So again, Nehemiah being the organizer says, okay, we got to get these things here. We got to get the tithe of the grain and new wine and oil, but we have to have somebody to oversee it. And so he sets people to oversee this, and it goes on, and it says, for they were considered faithful, and a task was distributed to the brethren. So that's the problem solved. That was easy enough. That is, you move Tobiah out. You start gathering the tithing of the grain, new wine, and oil, and he says somebody in charge of that that's going to be faithful, trustworthy to distribute to the Levites, to the priests, to the gatekeepers, to the singers. Then let's go on verse 15. Problem number 3. And problem number 3 was about the Sabbath day. Now, as I think about these problems in chapter 13, I think about kind of like the dedication of the wall, when they come together there in chapter 11 and 12, and they're serving God, they're dedicating the walls to God. It's easy to be involved in ritualism and ceremony, but a lot of times people do that, and then as soon as they leave the ceremony, they forget what they're supposed to be doing. Well, here's the case where the Sabbath day, the breaking of the Sabbath days, because of verse 15, It said those days saw people in Judah trading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Now, of course, what this problem is that they had just said, they had renewed the covenant with God, but honestly, the law of God said, the law of Moses said, you shall not work on Saturday, you shall keep the Sabbath day holy. Well, they weren't. They were treating it as an ordinary work day, where they're going out there, and it says there to bring in things into Jerusalem. And then you go down verse 16, is you have another group of people. You had Jews, talked about in verse 15, but 16 said men of Tyre. Now, men of Tyre are going to be Gentiles. That's a Gentile nation. That's not the Jewish nation. But these men dwelt there also. He brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. So these Gentiles is using this as opportunity to also make money here and to be involved in commerce and buying and selling, trading. Obviously, if they're bringing in their goods into Jerusalem, that means the Jews are buying on that day. And so we have basically a casting off of the law of God by the Sabbath day. And so what's Nehemiah going to do about this? Now, verse 17, we see basically four things he mentions. One is, he says, I contend with the nobles of Judah. In other words, he went straight to the leadership, those in power, position of authority, and he's going to talk to them. He's going to deal with them. And he said, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day? He lays it squarely at their feet. This is your responsibility here. And then the second thing is, he says, in verse 19, so was the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, I command the gates to be shut, and charge them must not be opened until after the Sabbath. And so he's going to shut the city up. He's going to put a physical barrier, basically to stop them coming into Jerusalem and buying, selling on the Sabbath day. So he basically commands the gates to be shut. And then the third thing is that I post some of my servants at the gates so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. He puts me in there to stop this, which is kind of another physical barrier. And so then he goes to the next thing, and that is, some people weren't discouraged enough by that. And so verse 20 said, now the merchants, sellers of all kinds of wares lodge outside Jerusalem once or twice. Then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I'll lay hands on you. So that's the fourth thing. And that is, he threatened those that were the merchants coming to Jerusalem and standing outside the city, and maybe thinking that the gates would be open the next day on the Sabbath day and to come on in anyway. And he said, you keep on doing this, I'm going to lay hands on you. And it doesn't specify what that means. What that means is they'll have them arrested, whether it means that they were going to threaten them more, I don't know. But basically he said, you're not going to get by with this. We're going to keep the Sabbath day. And so as you look at it, it says from that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And so that's what they do, how they handles that. Then we have the next problem. I mean, it's kind of like one problem after another, isn't it, here in Jerusalem? And that is, you have intermarriage. Ezra dealt with the intermarriage also. And that Ezra had to basically tell the Jews to set aside their foreign wives and their children. They could not intermarry with the people of the land. Well, here in Nehemiah 13, chapter verse 23, it says, in those days also Jews had married women at Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Now, we just got through saying that God has specifically said that Ammon and Moab were not to be allowed inside the assembly. And so these folks are going out there and marrying people they should not have. And so verse 24, and it says the result of this here is half their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one of the other people. And that is, they have intermarried, and in their communication have become corrupted. You know, one thing about the ability to communicate is it's our ability to express ideas and to get along with one another. And if you can't speak the same language, you're going to have real problems. And so you just think about, maybe, I know it's different, but sometimes we talk about the generation gap. or maybe younger people use words differently in different ways than what older people use words, and have that the meanings change here, and it creates confusion in communication. Well, that's what you have here. You had them being confused about the communication. And so the impact of this is that there's confusion among the children of Israel, beside the fact they were breaking the law of God. And so to solve that problem, that Nehemiah in verse 25, again, approaches head on. He says, so I contend with them, and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives or sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. So he's having to do, and he doesn't really specifically say here like Ezra does, you're going to have to get rid of your foreign wives and your children, but really that is the implication of this, that they cannot remain in these marriages because of they're not supposed to be in those marriages by law, and also the creation of confusion that was going on, that the only way to solve this is, again, to not remain, to not allow this to happen. And as you look at, now this is somewhat different, and maybe a point of contrast here as far as the law of Moses versus the law of Christ. As Christians, we find that in the New Testament there were Christians who are obviously married to non-Christians. In those cases there, they weren't told to simply to separate, to set aside their wives or their husbands. And in 1 Corinthians 7, chapter verse 12, and it's talking about a woman who's married to a non-believer, or a man's married to a non-believer, and he talks about them remain in that condition. And so verse 12 says, but the rest I, not the Lord, say, if a brother has a wife who does not believe, and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman has a husband who does not believe, he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children will be unclean. But now they are holy. But the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister not under bond in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And so this is one of the differences here. And as far as the law of Christ, we're not told to set aside non-believers. We're told to remain in there, and maybe we'll have a good influence upon them. Maybe we will be able to teach them the Word of God, and they will become believers. They will obey the gospel. But back to Nehemiah here, we have Nehemiah says, okay, you can't allow your sons and daughters to be married to these foreign people. But then also he points out the results of somebody that did marry foreign wives and the results it had on the nation of Israel. Because you look at verse 26 in Nehemiah 13th chapter. He said, did not Solomon king of Israel sin by these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him. He was beloved as God, and God made him king of all Israel. And we think about Solomon, we often refer to him as the wisest man ever to live, because God gave him this great wisdom. But the last part of this verse, he said, nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. We need to think about the influence others have on us. And so he said to these people right here, Solomon himself, this wise man, married these foreign wives, and they drew his heart away from God. That's what he thinks will happen to us. And as you go on in verse 28, we see how bad the situation was. Because the son of Elisha, now the son of Elisha is the high priest. The high priest and they said the son of Elisha, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore, I drove him out from before me. Sanballat was another one of those people who opposed the children of Israel in building the walls around Jerusalem. He was another enemy of the children of Israel. And so even he had influenced the priesthood as far as the son-in-law of being, or his son marrying into the family of this man. Well, and the final thing about this chapter is that the number of times Nehemiah calls upon God to remember him. Now again, Nehemiah, as you read through this here, was a godly man. He sacrificed greatly in order to serve God, in order to help others. He stood for the truth. And so as you look at verse 14 of the 13th chapter, he said, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds I have done for the house of my God for services. So he calls upon God to remember for the good things he had done. Then in verse 22 it says, I command the Levites they should cleanse themselves, and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. And then he said, remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to your greatness of your mercy. And then in verse 29, he said, remember them, O my God, because they had defiled the priesthood and covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. And what Nehemiah is talking about here is that God will remember us. And hopefully what he's going to remember are the good things we have done. And that we need to not be so concerned about what other people think about us, but we need to be concerned about what God thinks about us, about how God views us, our lives, and our service to him. And Nehemiah had done great. And God honestly remembered him because we had this book written to tell us all about Nehemiah and the good things he had done there. I do appreciate you watching this, and hopefully it's been helpful in your study of Nehemiah. If you can, go and be with us at Lilac Road. Our building is located 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky. Time of services, Sunday mornings at 9:30 we have Bible class, and at 10:25 is worship. Sunday, 5 p.m. we have worship, and Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. we have Bible class. If I can aid you in any way, answer any questions, or maybe aid you and help that you need, let me know. But I thank you for watching, and feel free to share this, hit the like button. Have a good week.